I'd like to welcome students, faculty. I'd like to welcome also members of the community. Our Provost and Dean of Faculty, Tracy Hucks, is here and will say a few words in just a few minutes. Thank you very much for coming tonight, Tracy. Before I ask Tracy to make her comments, though, I want to acknowledge the support, the friendship of our alumni donors, the friends of Pete Schaehrer, Colgate class of 1965, whose generosity and work make tonight's event possible. The Schaehrer Memorial Lecture is now in its 10th year, and we look forward to continuing the series as well as launching other initiatives to honor Pete's legacy. We're very grateful for your contributions, and we look forward to further developing our partnership as PCON draws nearer to its 50-year anniversary, 2020. I want to thank in particular Dan Schuckers, class of 65, who did so much to organize and shepherd our donors in advance of tonight's lecture. Thank you. Among Pete's friends and classmates, Rick Steggy deserves very special thanks. Together with my colleague Dan Monk, Rick came up with the vision for this lecture series and led the effort to get it up and running. Rick was unable to travel for this year's lecture. This is the first time in 10 years that Rick has not been able to be with us, but he is at home watching via live stream, and I hope taking a moment to reflect on the role that he's played in bringing us together to honor Pete Schaehrer by carrying on the work and the values that Pete lived for. Rick, thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and it does not feel right at all to be here tonight without you. I'd be remiss as well if I didn't mention and thank PCON's program assistant, Amanda Stewart. The planning, the logistics for tonight's event is really an extraordinarily heavy lift, and Amanda does the bulk of this so that I don't have to. I realize just now that I neglected to introduce myself. My name is Zan Karn, and I am the director of the Peace and Conflict Studies program, as well as being a faculty member in the history department. Thank you again for your attendance. I'd like to ask now if Dean Hucks would come to the lectern to say a few remarks. Tracy Hucks, Colgate's Provost, Dean of Faculty, and the James A. Storing Professor of Religion and Africana and Latin American Studies. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening. And the most important part of that introduction is class of 1987 and 1990, Colgate University. It's very good to be here this evening. I wanted to ask you to please excuse me in advance. The Colgate Board of Trustees are here on campus for this weekend, and so I'll be dividing my time between you here this evening and the Board of Trustees who are down at the Colgate Inn. But I wanted to add an added welcome to you at a moment in Colgate's history when the university turns 200 years old and has begun to celebrate its bicentennial with a year-long set of on-campus and off-campus events. This week is Founders Week, and this evening's lecture is one of the many important events featured in this week. As I welcome guests and members of the Colgate community, I would also like to personally welcome this year's 2018 Peter Schaehrer Memorial Lecturer, Professor Steve Coll from Columbia University School of Journalism. We look forward to hearing your lecture on Grand Delusions and for the rich fellowship and questions that will follow. You will know that as soon as you end your lecture and Professor Coll calls for questions, the student hands are going to rise up. Finally, I extend my appreciation to all of the faculty and students who comprise the success of Peace and Conflict Studies here at Colgate. Peace and Conflict Studies is the elder of the university's interdisciplinary program, and Colgate looks forward to welcoming you back in 2020 when Pecan will celebrate its curricular and intellectual achievements in commemoration of its 50th anniversary. We welcome you back at that time. And again, I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you and really ask you to have a great time of engagement this weekend. Thank you.
We have yet another introduction to make, so bear with me, please. We're very fortunate, very excited to have Steve Coll with us here tonight as our guest. Steve is the Henry R. Luce Professor and Dean of the Journalism School at Columbia University. Between 1985 and 2005, he was a reporter, foreign correspondent, and senior editor at the Washington Post. He also served as managing editor of the Post from 1998 to 2004. The author of 8 books, Steve is a 2-time Pulitzer winner, including one for his book Ghost Wars, 2004, which relates directly to tonight's discussion. I'll make a few words, I'll share a few words more about Professor Coll's most recent book in just a moment, but first I'd like to ask Bill Hitchings, Colgate class of 65, to say a few more words about Pete Schaehrer, in whose honor we're gathered tonight, and about Rick Steggy, whose leadership we so deeply appreciate.
Good evening and welcome to the 10th annual Pete Schaehrer. I was going through my belongings as we moved a few months ago and found this photo of, the first thing I think is remarkable about it is the diversity that you see in the picture. The picture was taken in the fall of 1962. Pete Schaehrer is the second person in from the right in the second row up. And Rick Steggy is the bottom person in the bottom row right there in the middle. The picture to me stimulated what remains of my brain to reflect on events and people at that time that shaped each of us alumni individually, as well as on a national and a global scale. Tonight, those of us in this picture experienced and have lived through periods of both peace and intense conflict, just as you are now. A more complete understanding of these events is why Pecan is here today and so very important. 1961, that bottom class was entering Colgate. There were 350 of us. It is obvious from the diversity that it was not co-ed, and 98% of us were Caucasian, male Caucasians. A change for the better. 61 was also the year that JFK was inaugurated, and it was also the year of the Bay of Pigs invasion, where the CIA tried to take over the Fidel Castro. That was our first conflict, I think, in that year. 50 years ago, almost to the month, almost to the week, the U.S. went to the United Nations with evidence of Russian ballistic missiles in Cuba, and there was a week-long blockade of Cuba that led almost to a nuclear war. It was a Cold War, but the conflict was very, very apparent. 63 saw the March on Washington, D.C. 63 was when Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream. From recent events, we know that that dream has a long way to go before it's accomplished. 63 in November was also the year that JFK was assassinated, and for a moment time stood still. In 1964, as waves of students headed south on buses to enroll registered voters, We also had the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which essentially opened the gates for unlimited action to secure peace and security in Southeast Asia. We know where that went. 64 was also a year of political shifts. Mr. Goldwater was nominated to be President of the United States as Bob Dylan was singing "The Times They Are A-Changin'." 65 was our graduation year, and it began with the deployment of 200,000 troops to Vietnam. There were 10,000 when we entered in 1961. Also, the marches, the Selma marches in Alabama for voter registrations were going on. There was the year of the Watts rebellions, the Watts riots, and it was the year when Vietnam really began. Eventually, about 25–30% of our class went into the service. There was a mandatory draft at that point, and the draft was something we took very seriously. So about a third of us went. By the year 1975, 2.7 million people, troops, had been in Vietnam, and the names of 57,000 of those troops are on that granite wall in the mall. You and your contemporaries have been involved for 17 years with other locations, and we're going to hear about those a bit later. But you're very, very much involved. Let's go to the class. Pete was president of the Colgate Student Senate during our senior year. He then completed his doctorate at Columbia. He remained at Lehman College, where he was very much involved as an activist for peace. He was anti-war and very much pro-inclusive with the community. He was also a forceful public health advocate before succumbing to HIV/AIDS in 1989. This is before effective treatment really became available. A remarkable man, a very forceful man, a man of vision, a man of peace. Rick went to the University of Wisconsin Law School after he graduated from Colgate. He has presented cases in front of the United States Supreme Court for betterment in the Cleveland, Ohio community. He was also, 11 years ago, as has been pointed out, was the visionary behind laying out an appropriate remembrance for Pete Schaehrer, our classmate, our fraternity brother. So with Dan Monk and Rick and Dan and others, we went and we raised money, hopefully enough to keep this lecture going in perpetuity. Rick is tonight in the hospital. The broadcast is being sent to him, and we all wish him for an uncomplicated outcome for Rick and Elaine. God bless Rick. In conclusion, I've coined a new word. I've just told Nancy about it. We've gone from the Schaehrer boys to the Colgate grandfathers. My word to you is get involved, stay involved in this milieu. We need you now more than ever. We need you guys here. Thank you for allowing us to come back. It's a pleasure to return.
The book from which tonight's lecture is drawn is a massive achievement. Long listed for the 2018 National Book Awards, Directorate S will be the definitive account of America's wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan. No other work to date more clearly explains the reasons for America's failures in these theaters, and no other work distills so well the mistakes and lessons of America's longest wars. Professor Coll digs into the bureaucracies that govern America's military and intelligence networks, and he elaborates the difficulties of implementing a coherent program of action where clashing personalities and divergent institutional cultures fail to mesh. He alerts us to the dangers of crafting policy to satisfy emotional needs and serve political ends without full consideration to strategic efficacy. He helps us to understand the insufficiencies of military orthodoxies and existing legal frameworks in an amorphous conflict zone whose boundaries and topography are constantly shifting. At the same time, Steve leads readers to see the moral and practical dangers of skirting the laws of war and resorting to, quote, exceptional measures at moments of crisis and under duress. Like the wars it describes, Directorate S, I believe, is a story about tragedy. It speaks to the clumsiness of American policymakers and operatives with respect to history, both the inability to internalize crucial lessons from the past, as well as the stubborn refusal to relinquish old, outmoded ideas and tools in the face of new challenges. Please join me once again in welcoming Steve Coll, whose presentation tonight is titled Grand Delusions, Understanding America's Failed Counterinsurgency in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Zan. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. I know it's what we used to call in Washington a busy news day, and this is not exactly on point, but I appreciate your being here. When Zan got in touch, I accepted because Colgate has always played this slightly mysterious footnote in my life. I've never been here before. It's beautiful. But when I was applying to college a long time ago, college admissions was not yet like a major sector of the national economy, and I didn't have a lot of advice. My approach was completely random, and I only applied to 3 schools. I only visited one of them, and I was accepted by Colgate, which I understood to be the best of the schools that I had applied to in reputation. But I was also accepted to Occidental College in Southern California. I'd never been west of Chicago, and I remember going to the library and looking up like research about average snowfall and temperatures in Hamilton, New York, and I thought, you know, I have a sense of manifest destiny to these beaches in Southern California. So I went west, but I've always wondered if my life would have been different if I'd come here, and I certainly am delighted to see what a beautiful campus it is. Okay. I'm going to talk just for a little more than half an hour, and then I'm really looking forward to your questions. My purpose is to try to give you a flavor of a very complicated history from the time the United States went barreling into Afghanistan after the September 11th attacks until something like the present day, and to try to give you a sense of what I think the big picture is, and also a little flavor of the characters and some of the conflicts and episodes that really drove this misadventure at its various stages. You know, for those of you who would have no reason to know, this is my territory because of accidental assignment. When I was a foreign correspondent at the Washington Post, I was sent out to South Asia as a correspondent in the early 1990s and spent a lot of time on the ground in Pakistan and Afghanistan as a beat reporter. Then I came back in the mid-90s when I was an international investigative correspondent for the Post. And then after 2001, I wrote that book Ghost Wars, but also kept going back to the region for the New Yorker magazine, you know, more or less as a magazine-type beat reporter. So I've spent a lot of time in the region over 30 years. And when I was telling Zan at dinner that when I was in college, I was inspired to write these kinds of works because of the example of the post-Vietnam journalists who had been on the ground in the war, David Halberstam for the New York Times, Neil Sheehan for the UPI, who came home and then pulled together, from a journalist perspective, the definitive accounts of how America failed, how America became entangled in Vietnam, Bright Shining Lie probably being the most exemplary of those books, but The Best and the Brightest by Halberstam being another very important one. So these books, this work came out of the Vietnam era for me because I grew up in college reading that work thinking someday I'd like to do this. I had no idea that our country would be embroiled in these particular circumstances or that I would be accidentally on the ground when some of it developed. So that's a photograph of something that happened just about 6 months before I turned up in the region in 1989. That's from February 15th, 1989, and it's a photograph of what was called the limited contingent of Soviet forces in Afghanistan, which was what the Soviet occupation force in the 1970s was called, withdrawing from Afghanistan across the Amu Darya River, which officially ended the era of Soviet combat operations in the country. And it was, at that time, the 40th Army was commanded by a guy named General Boris Gromov. And dramatically, in that sort of style that's sometimes familiar, he rode in the last armored personnel carrier, and when he was halfway across the bridge, he got down out of the vehicle, and he turned his back on Afghanistan. He walked into what was then Soviet territory, and his son greeted him with a bouquet of flowers. And that was the end of the Soviet war. It had begun with an invasion in 1979 and an extremely costly occupation throughout that decade from the Afghan point of view. When we consider the losses that we have created with our war and suffered in our own forces and among our civilians, we have to put it into perspective of the Soviet war, which took an estimated 1 to 2 million Afghan lives during that decade, a lot of carpet bombing, indiscriminate fighting. But our war since 2001 has been costly enough. More than 2,000 American deaths, soldiers and contract workers, hundreds of contractors in addition to those 2,000, 20,000 injuries, and the total deaths caused during the American-led war in Afghanistan since 2001 estimated about 140,000 by some researchers at Brown University who have tried to make the best estimate from the data available. We were supposed to end this war at the end of 2014. President Obama pledged that he would end both the Iraq and Afghan wars that he had inherited. That's a photograph of a ceremony that transferred the official combat role of the United States in Afghanistan to Afghan ownership. The green flag that says RS is it stands for Operation Resolute Support. It was held not on the Amu Darya River bridge, but inside a basketball gymnasium in a heavily fortified headquarters compound at the heart of Kabul. The United States wasn't leaving exactly, but it was ending combat, and Resolute Support was meant to be an advise and assist operation that would officially end U.S. combat commitments in Afghanistan. There's a copy of the program that's handed out to everyone, the Afghans and the international diplomats and military leaders who came. It had instructions about how to duck and cover in the event of a rocket attack, which was expected during the ceremony. So it was not a glorious ending of the war. In fact, I had a very funny email just this morning as I was coming up from someone who had read the book and had read the account of that ceremony, and he was the equivalent of Amanda who had organized the whole thing. He wrote me like 5,000 words about how absurd it was, like some Afghan turned up with a tuba, but he didn't have an identity card. They weren't sure if the tuba was loaded with explosives. They didn't know what to do. So anyway, it turned out actually not to be the end of the war. Because about a year later, when a branch of the Islamic State emerged in eastern Afghanistan, the United States went back into direct combat in Afghanistan against the Islamic State, and today we are still at war as the United States, fighting unilaterally on a counterterrorism framework against this Islamic State group in eastern Afghanistan, and then we are also still carrying out this advise and assist war with special forces often on the ground with Afghan commandos on the front lines fighting the Taliban. So how did we get from there to here, and why did the United States struggle so hard and without much success to achieve the goals that it announced for itself and for its allies in Afghanistan. The book's title, Directorate S, refers to one of the fundamental problems in the war, which was the sanctuary that the guerrillas, the Taliban guerrillas, and also Al-Qaeda enjoyed across the border from Afghanistan in Pakistan, and particularly in western Pakistan. The United States was well acquainted with the history of Pakistani intelligence. The main intelligence service in Pakistan is called ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence. And the CIA had collaborated with ISI during the 1970s and the 1980s to defeat the Soviet occupation. And they had also collaborated in a strategy that made sure that the sanctuary the rebels enjoyed inside Pakistan provided a basis for the guerrillas to retreat and refit, have medical care, have training, have weapon supplies, and that was a substantial reason why, despite all the bombs the Soviets dropped, despite all the troops they put against the border, despite all the special forces they put into the war, they ended up going home across the bridge. So the CIA knew all about this history, and yet Directorate S, which is the unit of ISI that does covert action with groups like the Taliban, ended up running the same playbook against the United States that the CIA had run with ISI against the Soviet Union. And in a kaleidoscope of failures, including many having nothing to do with Pakistan and having everything to do with Washington, Directorate S was a central one, and also one that was, the nature of that failure is particularly hard to understand considering the history of the United States running that same kind of strategy against the Soviets. So what I want to do is give you a flavor of this history by talking about four big themes about why we're here where we are 18 years later in this stalemate with an Afghan government that's very fragile, with all these losses in the rearview mirror. The first one is the problem of war aims, our inability to define them, and our inability to align our resources and our strategy with the objectives of, that these resources could obtain. The second is the failure of our relationship with Hamid Karzai, who was the face of a restored democratic Afghanistan and a restored Afghan constitution, and who was celebrated in the international community, 10 years ago as the symbol of the success of the American war in Afghanistan, but who eventually became bitterly estranged from the United States and, in fact, undermined quite a lot of what the U.S. was trying to do toward the end of his presidency. Third, and this is in the title, the illusions of our counterinsurgency strategy in the war, particularly late in the last part of the Bush administration and the first part of the Obama administration, when we went big in Afghanistan again, somehow overlooking all of the lessons of the Vietnam War and the kind of bubble of enthusiasm that sprouted up for a few years around the efficacy of counterinsurgency doctrine, which really refers to a combined political and military strategy on the ground, but is often indistinguishable from just a violent counter-guerrilla war. If you've ever seen the movie Battle of Algiers, you have a pretty good sense of what it's made up of. And then finally, I would talk about the failure of our political and diplomatic strategy and how that ended up creating a whole series of contradictions in the war that we have still failed to resolve. So the Bush administration and the Obama administration ended up carrying out something like a dozen to 18 secret interagency strategy reviews. And my job as a journalist historian was to try to excavate this decision-making, the intelligence that informed it, the debates that occurred and how they were resolved. And one of my problems as a writer was that all these strategy reviews year after year kept occurring in the same classified conference room in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, which is that big, ornate Ulysses Grant era building right next to the West Wing of the White House, where if you ever go into government and you rise to a certain level of middle or deputy middle level, you will end up going into that building and you'll be sitting around a conference table debating people from other agencies about what should be done. And essentially, the problem of I was going to say the problem as a writer is that these reviews are so repetitious. They keep coming in with the same groups of people representing the same offices, being briefed with the same intelligence about the Afghan war. Here are the different ethnic groups. Here's a map of Taliban control. Here's where little al-Qaeda pockets are located. Here's the political context. Here's the trends over the last 6 months. Here's how drugs figure. And then the fact briefers would leave the room, and the policymakers would debate, well, what should be done? And what they really struggled with more than anything was the basic question that I'm sure many of you harbor from time to time, if you think about the war at all, which is, why are we there? Why are we there? And after 2005 and 2006, when the United States began to escalate its military involvement in the war, after having won this lightning victory in the fall of 2001. Remember, right after 9/11, the United States went fast into Afghanistan with a CIA-led paramilitary operation that had very swift success, and the Taliban government that had been there, infamous for its treatment of women, for its executions in stadiums, for its destruction of Buddhist statues in Bamiyan, fell by December. So we went in late September. The Taliban were gone by December. The country was revived, a new constitution was written. The Taliban revived with Directorate S and the ISI involved. By 2006, the United States is talking now about sending young men and women, volunteers now, not draftees, but young American men and women back to combat to try to win this war that everyone thought had been won in 2001. And so it was the duty of these strategy reviews to ask, why are we there? What vital interests of the United States justify the risks and the losses and the costs of sending American soldiers to this Afghan war? And they kept being stumped by a couple of problems. The most consequential review of this kind that took place during the Bush administration happened at the end of the administration in 2008. And someone read to me the kind of first sentence of the classified result of the review, which is in the book, which is, the United States is not losing in Afghanistan, but it's not winning either, and that's not good enough. So the framework of analysis was, this has become a guerrilla war. It's looking like a stalemate. We keep moving back and forth across the battlefield with the Taliban, but we're not making fundamental progress, so we need to invest more in the war in order to defeat the Taliban. When the Obama administration came in, they felt that they had inherited a mess. The president had campaigned saying Iraq was a mistake, and if I'm president, I'm going to focus our resources away from Iraq and on the menace that really brought us out of the United States into this region after 2001, which is al-Qaeda. I'm going to fight the right war, and I'm going to make up for the Bush administration's mistakes in Iraq by refocusing toward Afghanistan. So he kind of pledged to fight this war. But then when he got into office, he was presented with a lot of pressure from military leaders to start sending troops rapidly in the tens of thousands, reasons to do with an election calendar. Sorry, Mr. President, you can't dawdle here. He commissioned reviews, and as the first year in office went along, he became more and more skeptical about this war that he had inherited and his own decision to resource it. So he asked these groups gathered in room 446 at the Eisenhower building to really answer this question seriously. Impress me as a Harvard law educated judge. What are the vital interests of the United States that justify the sacrifices I am now ordering? And they spent really months across two reviews wrestling this question to the ground. And they came up with two answers. One was al-Qaeda, which was still active and significant in 2009 in Waziristan and was carrying out plots to kill civilians on the subway in New York or in London or related places. They were not defeated. Bin Laden was still alive and still at large. And the second was the security of Pakistan's nuclear weapons. Pakistan has about 100 nuclear weapons, maybe a few more by now. And all along, the idea that those weapons could fall into the wrong hands was seen as the worst case scenario of this very unstable war. But think about it, in 2009, those two vital interests, you could argue with them, but they're certainly good candidates if you're going to define vital interests in this conflict. In 2009, both of those problems are in Pakistan. Al-Qaeda was entirely in Pakistan. It had fled from Afghanistan after 2001 over the border, and from 2002 on settled in western Pakistan, kind of lawless territory, sometimes in the cities. And of course, Pakistan's nuclear weapons were not in Afghanistan either. So why were we sending, someone asked, 150,000 troops next door to secure vital interests that are over there? Smart people, they recognized the contradiction, they argued about it, and they decided that if the Taliban won in Afghanistan, Afghanistan would collapse, that would destabilize Pakistan, and Al-Qaeda might return to Afghanistan. Okay, fair enough, but a rather indirect and speculative and unsatisfactory basis to send young people into combat, very violent combat in some instances. President Obama, as the war went along, he could not figure out how to resource a war against the Taliban enough to win it. He had no appetite for an ever war against the Taliban, and that leads to the second big problem about war aims that kept recurring, which is, are the Taliban our enemy? Are they? They're indigenous. It was Bob Gates, a Bush appointee as the Secretary of Defense, who said, they're a part of Afghanistan. They're embedded in sections of the Pashtun population in the south and east. We're not likely to ever defeat them militarily. There were no Afghans on the plains on September 11th. The Taliban could be held complicit for the 9/11 attacks because they gave shelter to Al-Qaeda when they planned and organized the attacks. But it's not even clear that Mullah Muhammad Omar, then the leader of the Taliban, knew about the 9/11 conspiracy. And in any event, since then, the Taliban had organized no terrorist attacks against the United States. They kept saying to anyone who would listen to them, we're only fighting you because you came into our country and are occupying it. We are not interested in fighting a war outside of our borders with anyone. And we have no record of actually doing that. We're just trying to liberate our country from you and the puppets that you've installed in Kabul. Well, Obama made it clear to the White House side, he didn't really want to fight a war against the Taliban. He was focused on Al-Qaeda. That was the threat to American civilians. And so sometimes his aides would come into these debates and they'd say, have we ever really said that we're going to defeat the Taliban? Is that really our policy? Because it's always been kind of confusing as to where the Taliban fit in this, at least over the last 4 or 5 years. And the next day, the Pentagon representatives come back with a big PowerPoint deck showing all the statements by American national leaders pledging to defeat the Taliban. And they said, well, you may not want to fight this war, but you've said you would, and a bunch of Afghans that depend on you think that you're committed to their security. So yes, we are at war with the Taliban. Okay. Find my little button. Do it that way. Hamid Karzai. Remember him? You guys were probably 10 years old, some of you. If you were paying attention to Hamid Karzai at the time that he stopped being Afghanistan's president around 2014, you probably had the impression that he was an unstable, unreliable, bitter, and angry man who had turned against the United States despite being entirely dependent on the United States for his role as president of Afghanistan. He became president as part of a remarkable effort to rewrite and revive Afghanistan's 1960s era constitution following the fall of the Taliban. He had spent most of the 90s, when the Taliban were in power, as an exile in Pakistan. The Taliban assassinated his father. He was motivated against the Taliban, but he was from the same Pashtun ethnic lineage that the Taliban draws their greatest strength from. He was one figure, not very strong, had no constituency of his own, but he was the one person who could balance all of the interests that came into Afghanistan after the Taliban's fall. The ISI, Pakistan, were content with his role because he was a Pashtun. The Northern Alliance, who knew him as genuinely anti-Taliban, and the international community was looking for an educated figure. There's a scene later in his time when he starts to get bitterly divided from the United States, when he's walking in a garden with one of his ministers, and the minister says, you know, when you first came to power, they treated you as if you were the Afghan Mandela. Now they treat you as if you were the Afghan Mugabe. It's not fair. But we should take responsibility for some of what we did wrong. You know, I've covered Karzai as a beat reporter in the Afghan theater for years and years. I've interviewed him, covered him at press conferences, seen him in lots of different settings, and I thought when I started this project that I had a pretty good sense of him as a person. And I was really wrong. When I excavated his relationship with the United States, I saw that behind the public veneer of instability and rash statements and sometimes quite violent language that he would use about the United States toward the end of his time was something very consistent, which is that he thought that the real heart of the war was in Pakistan, that it was ISI, and that the Americans could do something about this, that the Taliban enjoyed sanctuary in Pakistan, that they were getting training and arms, that they were wearing the equivalent of military uniforms, they were being trained on sophisticated weapons as the years go along, and the United States knew about this. It had run the same playbook against the Soviets, so why aren't you doing something about it? And when you look at the record of meetings, every time he met with an American or an international official, his first and last statement or question was, the war's in Pakistan, why aren't you doing something about it? And it really was quite consistent. There's a scene in the summer of 2008 when candidate Obama is running for president. He was a senator. He makes his first visit to Afghanistan. He goes in to meet the Afghan cabinet. The Afghan cabinet is very fractious. All the different factions are somehow barely holding together, but they get together before Obama arrives. And they say, you know, this guy could be next president of the United States. Let's organize what he hears from us. And they all agree. We're just going to say, ISI, 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 Pakistan, do something. Put some pressure on them. And they do that. And of course the United States doesn't change Pakistan's conduct. Maybe we'll leave it for question time. Could the United States change Pakistan's conduct? But the effect on Karzai is very specific. In that part of the world, putting one and one together and getting three is pretty common, and he developed a theory which was pretty logical. The United States is the world's hyperpower. If it wanted Pakistan's behavior to change, interfering in the war, supporting the Taliban, creating sanctuary that al-Qaeda exploited, if it wanted to do that, it could. It's not, so therefore it must want Pakistan to destabilize Afghanistan. Why? Because war justifies a long-term U.S. military presence in the region, and without war the U.S. would have to go home. So this is all a conspiracy to essentially keep forward bases in Afghanistan. Now, this drove the Americans crazy. They thought that it was misguided. There's a scene where an envoy goes out named James Dobbins to talk to Karzai, and he says, Mr. President, you know, by now you've got all of the WikiLeaks documents, all the State Department documents, you've got all the Snowden documents, millions of classified American records. Can you see any evidence in those records of this conspiracy that you've described? And Karzai looks at him and kind of smiles. So maybe you don't know the plan. You know, there is a deep state in the United States. Might not inform you about the conspiracy. So the other problem and the other reason this relationship and the constitutional politics associated with it fell apart had to do with the changeover from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. Typical in Washington, when one administration comes in, it thinks that everything the previous administration did was wrong and just starts to do the opposite. In this case, there was a critique that Bush's close relationship with Hamid Karzai had coddled him, had created an environment in which he allowed corruption to flourish, the drug economy to rise, and that he needed to be given some tough love. So they sent Joe Biden out to the region early in the administration. He met with Karzai, and Karzai said the same thing he said to everyone, you know, Mr. Vice President, the problem is in Pakistan, the problem is ISI. Unless you change that equation, this war is going to grind into a deeper stalemate, notwithstanding the tens of thousands of troops that are pouring in. And Biden said to him, Mr. President, Pakistan is 50 times more important to the United States than Afghanistan. Maybe not the most diplomatic way to start the relationship, but, you know, a kind of Biden-esque expression of the contradictions in U.S. policy. We're fighting this war to keep Pakistan stable, but we're fighting it in Afghan villages, kicking down doors, putting people in handcuffs and sending them off to temporary prisons, and stirring up a population that Karzai knew better than the Americans did was just about at the end of its rope. Speaking of kicking down doors, the counterinsurgency bubble. That's Richard Holbrooke and Hillary Clinton. Holbrooke was the special envoy who had started his career in Vietnam in the Corps program as a young civil service officer, had fought in the Balkans, and then was desperate to become Secretary of State when Obama was elected, but he had been Hillary's chief foreign policy advisor during the 2008 campaign, and he had written some harsh words that candidate Clinton had spoken against Obama, and even though Obama and Hillary Clinton reconciled and worked effectively together, their staffs never forgave one another. And Holbrooke was the target of their particular ire because he had a big personality, and he couldn't stop talking about the parallel to Vietnam. Holbrooke was one of those characters in journalism who we call good for journalism, meaning that he was very accessible, he was always willing to gossip, he would have lunch on a Saturday, all in background, but you would learn a lot by staying in touch with him. And I remember having lunch with him in 2010 in Washington on a Saturday, and he was mortified because the president really didn't want to hear about Vietnam. And Holbrooke seemed to be able to say, by way of warning about Afghanistan, nothing without reference to it. And finally, the president got so fed up that he asked his staff to call Hillary Clinton and order Holbrooke never to mention Vietnam again in the president's presence. And apparently this had just happened before we had lunch, this was on background. As a working reporter, I wasn't going to use much of it, but fortunately became part of my archive for later work. And I was running the recorder, and when I went back over it more recently for this, he was just saying that this had happened, he was embarrassed, and then he paused and he said, they really shouldn't be so afraid of history. But he was ignored. The president made a speech in 2009 in which he announced that 100,000 American troops, 100,000 at their peak, would enter the Afghan war against the Taliban for the purpose of securing the vital interests that we mentioned before. There would be 150,000 total international combat troops. He also did the unusual thing of announcing an exit date 2 years after the beginning. This reflected Obama's deep skepticism about the military advice he was getting about counterinsurgency doctrine. Counterinsurgency doctrine was almost a bubble, an intellectual bubble in Washington in this period, a little bit like Bitcoin or, tulips. General David Petraeus, very charismatic, very effective general, had sold the Bush administration counterinsurgency doctrine as a cure to the Iraq War, had led a surge force into Baghdad, and gone into neighborhoods with heavily armed troops, and also negotiated with different factions of the war in Iraq to flip. And the perceived success of that in stabilizing Baghdad endowed Petraeus with enormous influence in Washington, and he's kind of a military intellectual. He has a PhD in international relations from Princeton. He collects a lot of PhDs around him. One of the very charming people, one of them was the author of a book called Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, which is about counterinsurgency experience. They were always watching the Battle of Algiers to try to get everyone to rethink military strategy. And Obama was pretty skeptical that this would work, but he felt unable to prevent it. One of the big problems in transferring counterinsurgency doctrine from Iraq to Afghanistan was the basic math of counterinsurgency theory, which is typically that if you want to secure a restive or rebellious population using this doctrine in rural or urban areas, you need roughly one typical ratio of 20 soldiers and police to every 1,000 inhabitants. Now, if you did the math in Afghanistan, that meant you needed 600,000 forces, which was not going to happen. So they solved the math problem by narrowing the focus to 80 so-called key terrain districts out of the 400 roughly administrative districts in Afghanistan, concentrating them in Taliban country, but they couldn't even cover all of Taliban country. It became this kind of overdetermined diagram with a lot of technical jargon. I used to go to these briefings, for the New Yorker, and you'd hear lots of majors and colonels say things like, we're going to make sure the population is attached to the government. But there really wasn't much of an Afghan government to attach the population to, and this was what Holbrooke understood, and that the military kind of whistled past. There's a British envoy who figures in this named Gerard Coll, and he keeps saying, Afghan capacity is an illusion. There was this slogan, clear, hold, build, transfer. Clear the area, hold it, build something, and then transfer it to Afghan control. And Coll kept saying, it's an illusion. You can clear it. The Marines can clear anything. They can hold it if you order them to. But there's no Afghan partner to build, and not a national government to transfer to. The war that was fought in the South was really quite brutal, and I'll very quickly just read a passage, because one of the things I felt it was important to do just for myself was to account for the war on the ground that followed from these policy decisions and from these confusions. This was an invisible war substantially for lots of Americans. We have a voluntary military. It comes from parts of the country that support this voluntary military service. It goes home to parts of the country that are often off of our media screens, as we discovered during the 2016 election. And the full scale of what these soldiers were fighting and experiencing, especially in the South, at the height of this counterinsurgency war, where the vast majority of troops were sent to this area of southern Afghanistan, comprising parts of Kandahar province and parts of Helmand province. The Marines were in Helmand. That was a very brutal fight. And then these very stressed task forces of army people went into an area of Kandahar called the Green Zone, which is this irrigated agricultural area, very thick with vegetation, grape orchards, berms, makes Normandy look like a paved highway, to be honest, as fighting terrain. And the Taliban had embedded under this canopy for years, and the only way to get them out was basically to walk to contact out of these, forts. And a lot of the soldiers that were pulled into this fight, were, because the army was so stressed at that time, having fought in Iraq, and now surging into Afghanistan, they were misfits. They weren't trained for this kind of combat. So I'll just try to read just a touch from this experience. Platoons, so this is about walking into these, it's summer, it's about walking into these very thick groves, not only grapes, orchards, and other vegetables, but 10-foot tall marijuana plants. And one of the duties of the soldiers occasionally was to cut down the marijuana plants and burn them, which they thought was one of the better sides of their duty. But mostly it was incredibly perilous, because there were IEDs on every path, on every wall, hanging in trees, and the cost was instant death or dismemberment. Platoons depended on their most experienced sergeants to survive. Sergeant Josh Strickland had served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan before joining 3rd Platoon A Battery of the 1-320th, the artillery misfits, meaning this was a unit that was made up of artillerymen who were trained to fight from bases at long distance. They were basically engineers about landing shells at great distance. They had never done infantry combat before. During his first couple of weeks at Combat Outpost Nolan, Strickland's patrols could not walk 100 yards without hitting an IED or getting lit up by Taliban from several sides. Listening to the enemy radio talk, they learned the enemy knew they were artillery, not infantry. The first time Strickland's platoon got hit, he saw a young artilleryman burst out crying. The soldier screamed again and again, "I didn't sign up for this shit." In general, Strickland thought the lowest-ranking first-time soldiers adjusted to the stress better than the more experienced artillerymen because the rookies had no expectations from prior deployments. Because of Strickland's experience and uncanny ability to avoid IEDs, soldiers continually asked him to walk point on their patrols. He chose to walk 10 to 15 feet ahead of everyone else so that he could carefully identify the best route, and so that if he did make a mistake, it would cost one life instead of several. He was ultimately wounded and medevaced to Kandahar airfield 4 times. Each time as he recovered, a doctor would ask Strickland if he wanted to go back or go home. What am I going to say, he thought. He went back. By July, the IEDs and the escalating casualties had rattled even the most experienced infantrymen. In Zari, the 4 companies of the 1502, Alpha, aka Hard Rock, the Bulldogs of Bravo, Charlie or Cobra, Delta or the War Dogs, stepped down paths that the Taliban had been planting with IEDs for at least a month before the battalion arrived. Every soldier carried 70 to 90 pounds of gear, water and ammunition. They patrolled at night to avoid the sun or drank water continually to stave off dehydration and heat that soared daily above 100 degrees. The IEDs were so thick around the Bulldogs' encampment that they had to clear out 100 yards at a time. A lot of soldiers struggled with the stress. The first platoon started out with 19 men. After 3 patrols, they had 6 remaining. I think 80% of Bravo Company's personnel had to be replaced during Strickland's tour. So that wasn't on the front pages of any newspaper that I was reading during this time. You know, there was a sense that the war was by drones, that it was a helicopter war. In fact, 20,000 Americans came back without arms or legs as a result of close quarter combat like this that was mostly inflicted by IEDs. So the last thing I want to talk about before I take your questions, political strategy. So one of the contradictions in U.S. policy at almost every phase of the war was that whoever the commanding general was, and there were some really capable and well-trained ones, would go out to lead the war for 1 year at a time or 2 years at a time, and they would say to the public, to the Afghans, you know, this war is not winnable by military means alone. Certainly that was the doctrine, that was the assumption by 2006. And the intelligence, the maps of Taliban control versus Afghan government control versus NATO control proved it. They never shipped all of the independent data, the UN's maps. The war was a stalemate. And the generals would say, we can't win it militarily. And yet, year after year, command after command, military strategy, military units were resourced at the expense of political or diplomatic strategy. There was no regional diplomatic strategy. There was nothing like the effort that led to the Iran nuclear agreement or the opening to Cuba. This was not a diplomatic priority of the United States. Holbrooke was isolated from the Obama White House. That was one of the reasons. But it was also just inexplicable, in my judgment, that the political side was never resourced, even though the generals like David Petraeus, the counterinsurgency doctrine advocate, would say, we're not going to win this war on the battlefield. You can't capture and kill your way out of an industrial strength insurgency, he would say, such as the type that those artillerymen were walking through in southern Afghanistan. And yet, there were no negotiations for an awfully long time, and there was even a rejection by the military commanders of a diplomatic track. We need to batter the Taliban more before they'll decide to talk to us about anything meaningful. This guy is named Tayyab Agha. He was the chief Taliban negotiator for the only secret talks that occurred until just this year between the United States and the Taliban about an alternative to a forever war. They started in 2010. The book recounts the whole story of them. They failed in 2013. The first thing the Americans had to figure out was this guy for real, so it looks awfully young, who's he representing? They did determine that he was authorized by the Taliban's political commission to carry out negotiations with the United States. The first meeting took place in a safe house outside of Munich, Germany in 2010. The Germans had been talking to Taiabaga about the possibility of negotiations with the United States that might lead to an American withdrawal, might lead to the Taliban entering Afghan politics. And the Germans wanted this negotiation to happen, so they set a date. Taiabaga agreed, the Americans agreed after a long debate inside the National Security Council. About 3 weeks before the meeting, the German who was setting this up, a guy named Michael Steiner, calls the Obama White House and he says, "This is one issue. Taiabaga has asked me to ask you, express his anxiety. He's had a lot of Afghan friends come to meetings with Americans and then have them be snatched and sent off to Guantanamo. And he's a little worried that this whole meeting is just a setup." So they go up and tell Obama this, and the president says, "Well, please give Taiabaga my personal assurance that he will not be snatched. No matter what happens in this meeting, he'll be able to safely return to Qatar on the German plane that's going to bring him back and forth. Just give him my personal guarantee." They do. Taiabaga says, that's enough for me, I'm coming. Then the National Security Council staff at the White House who work for Obama, they get together as they're preparing for the meeting and they say, "You know what? This is a big government, CIA, Joint Special Operations Command, Pentagon. Just in case there's some kind of automated snatch machine down in the system that we can't control, let's not tell anyone, not tell the CIA, not tell the Pentagon what flight this guy's on, what the tail number is, what the dates are, what the times are, because we don't want to betray the president's promise to Taiabaga." That gives you a sense of how stovepipe the American system can be. Anyway, the negotiations ended in failure. The Americans learned quite a lot about Taiabaga and the Taliban's leadership, its unity, its ideas about politics, how it had changed since it had held power. But the whole thing ended in failure. I'll just conclude with the observation in the spirit of this miserable day in our national life. I think in 2021, we're still stalemated. The war is a structural stalemate for reasons we can discuss in a minute if you wish. But I think the best evidence, the best bet is that in 2021, when the next president is inaugurated or Donald Trump is re-inaugurated, we'll still be at this war. So thanks for listening.
So Steve has been kind enough to agree to take some questions from our audience tonight. I'll ask that members of the audience with questions, if you could move into the aisles, we'll provide you with a microphone there for the purposes of our video recording and live stream. I want to make two very brief announcements and then we'll get to questions. The first is that we will leave the auditorium in a short while and move on to Merrill House, where we have a reception planned. I'll invite members of the audience to join us there if you'd like to continue the conversation. I'd also like to bring to your attention tomorrow's seminar. Third floor of the Colgate bookstore in the Village. Steve and a group of us will be talking about possibilities for re-engagement with the Taliban, negotiating with the enemy, and what prospects that may hold for these wars and our forces. So I'd be happy to see questions now. I know students in particular must be eager to ask questions. Don't be shy.
There's only one.
Please, would you mind coming into the aisle and using a microphone? One microphone for that.
Hi, my name is Suki. I had a question about your opinion on the war on terrorism from two angles. One would be that terrorism is essentially an ideology in different senses, like for different groups. So do you see it as kind of futile that the fact that the U.S. is trying to use military power to fight an ideology because the biggest guns in the world can't kill an idea? And then for another reason is that when you look at whether the US indirectly commits crimes and like destabilizes governments and people's lives in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, or does it indirectly through financing like Saudi Arabia and what they're doing in Yemen right now? Do you see it as like people, it kind of inspires the people there to join rebel groups more because they see how Americans have ruined their lives? And like, do you think that those ideas like ever cross people's minds in Washington, and what do they think of that? And do they realize that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in particular, the war in Yemen is a travesty, and quite a lot of human rights reporting and journalism and even sort of congressional investigations have at least put some pressure on U.S. policy, but under this administration's policy of putting pressure on Iran in every possible way, the perceived role of Iran in the war in Yemen has generated this stalemate. You know, any of you who have worked in the Gulf or worked in Saudi Arabia, thinking that, you know, the air forces of Saudi Arabia and UAE, using the most high-tech aircraft and systems that the United States sells them at a very high price, are going to fight a responsible or even a legal war from the air, would just live in contradiction with all of their domestic story and the record. So it's a very dispiriting situation. In terms of ideology and military power as an instrument against counterterrorism, I guess, you know, my own sense is that there are occasions, exceptional occasions, when a cluster of military forces that is carrying out cross-border attacks can best be dealt with by, you know, a quick military operation. You know, when after Paris, thinking about the problem of Raqqa seemed like a reasonable thing to do, but these are the exceptions. Counterterrorism, the record of counterterrorism, just as a military operation, that is, getting people who have clear ill intent and then bringing them into court systems to bring them to justice, or people who have records of violence. Where is that ever effective? It's really not primarily effective through military operations, and it's certainly not effective through counter-ideological operations. We've spent lots of money on propaganda operations to try to put, you know, lipstick on our animal out there in the world. But where it's effective is at borders and with policing. I mean, you know, counterterrorism is a lot like organized crime policing. The place where networked groups or radicalized individuals are vulnerable is when they have to cross borders or when they come into contact with law enforcement in the ordinary course of the day. And, you know, by far the most effective operations that have defeated plots before they could kill hundreds of people in some cases have had this character. So, you know, I find border crossing, you know, enormously irritating, and the kind of structural racism that's been introduced by the Trump administration at the border is disturbing in its own right. But if you're asking what works in counterterrorism, that's the only place where there's evidence, basically.
Hi. Oh, sorry, everyone. I'm wondering how you experienced changes to U.S. foreign policy when you were on the ground as a foreign correspondent. Like, did you see U.S. policy actually changing things in the arenas that you were working in?
Yeah, it was certainly affecting things, maybe not achieving its objectives, but the law of unintended consequences is inevitable when you send guns and money into unstable societies, and when you spend, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars in reconstruction aid in a society that has a very thin capacity to absorb it, and of course you have distorting effects. And of course, corruption follows from that kind of structural approach. And that was true in Afghanistan, but it's been true in many other places from the Cold War forward. You know, during my time as a correspondent, The biggest thing that happened, of course, in the world was the end of the Cold War, fall of the Berlin Wall. And, you know, it was always felt kind of obscure to be a specialist in Afghanistan, at least before 9/11. You can imagine how obscure it felt when you're out covering, you know, Pakistan and Tiananmen is happening in China, the Berlin Wall falls, all of Eastern Europe regains its independence, Central Europe, and then the Soviet Union collapses. So, you know, in Ghost Wars, I was trying to figure out how it was that the first Bush administration decided to leave Afghanistan, because the total abrupt withdrawal of all U.S. support for centrist and you know, kind of traditional forces contributed to the Taliban's rise. And there was a sense after 9/11, oh, we made that mistake once before, let's not make it again. But I was curious, you know, well, when did they have a cabinet meeting and decide to leave Afghanistan? And the answer really was that they never even discussed it, because the world was changing so rapidly in so many different ways that Afghanistan just kept falling further and further down the agenda. It was probably always in the third tier, and it ended up in the fifth tier. And so this was a decision taken by kind of bureaucratic momentum rather than deliberation. I guess the last thing I'd say is, I hope it's responsive to your question. For my generation of international journalists, especially coming out of the big papers and having the privileges to go out and really work independently and be supported by the home base, and when I was working abroad, I didn't even know that the United States was in a recession for a year or two, because we were so well resourced, nothing ever changed. And those days, of course, are gone. But there were two kinds of experiences in the post-Cold War world, I think, and this showed up after 9/11. There were those who were on the ground for the fall of the Berlin Wall, the liberation of Central Europe, the restoration of sovereignty in the Baltics, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and who saw liberation and democratization and the reintroduction of market societies and the fall of the Soviet dictatorship and its satellite dictatorships as the story of the age. And when they came back to Washington on 9/11, their interpretation was duty to protect, intervention, saying that you can't have democracy in the Middle East is racist. They extrapolated their experience of Central Europe in the extraordinary events of 1989 to 1992 onto the world. And my generation of correspondents that were out in places that were just nightmarishly messy, and where the populations were constantly being roiled by the unintended consequences of American intervention, I think we tended to come back and say, beware. There are no easy paths in this kind of a world. And I was talking to a guy just last week who had long experience in Iraq and wrote a book about his experience on the civilian side. And in the introduction to his book, I've never heard it quite formulated this way, but it was bitter. His experience on the ground was bitter. He said, as an American citizen, if you think that an international foreign policy or military objective is important, then before pursuing it with our government, our military, all of our foreign policy expertise on the civilian side, think through whether it's important enough to you to pursue it really, really badly, because that's all that's going to happen. Like, if it's like World War II, and you just need to take these islands no matter how badly the whole thing is bollocksed up at different phases and you just hang in there, okay, that's, fair enough. But our system is so large, so stovepiped, so difficult to manage, and has so many unintended consequences that, if you come back from having cut your teeth on the ground in Afghanistan, you had a very different attitude towards intervention, I think, than if you were in the middle of the liberations.
Thanks.
We have other questions.
No.
Hey, so I'm a Green Beret, was in Afghanistan last year, so obviously we could talk probably all night about counterinsurgency and UW and FIT and such, but, and I think you're spot on most things. I think it's great. Just out of curiosity, so COIN it can be very nuanced, complex. Do you think it's unreasonable to ask conventional soldiers to conduct this on a large scale in Afghanistan by the tens, hundreds of thousands? And as well, yeah, I'll just take your thoughts on that. I'll save my thoughts on like the ceasefires and things that are coming up for tomorrow.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you'll be there tomorrow. I think that the easiest conclusion to reach, and it was what Bob Gates said when he was leaving government in the Obama administration, which is that anyone who recommends to the president that he send tens of thousands of conventional forces into Muslim societies to carry out counter-insurgency operations, I don't know, what was it? Should be shot? Should has a hole in his head or something like that. We've learned through bitter experience that that one problem is the expeditionary nature of the COIN theory, to have external forces go into complex societies where social organization, social identity, political negotiation, constitutional systems are beyond their comprehension. And then to expect in that environment to carry out a very sophisticated political military operation, policing operation that leaves the population feeling secure and well served. That's in a media-saturated age where every mistake, which creates also opportunities for the other side to do propaganda operations, knowing that the media isn't always going to be able to tell the difference between one or the other. I don't know, look, the imperial colonial era doesn't make a very good case for expeditionary counterinsurgency wars, but it hasn't gotten any better, no matter how many PhDs are brought to the problem. It's structural. You know, where political military pressure on a guerrilla movement may sometimes yield either military successes or more likely the conversion of that guerrilla movement into politics, so to reduce violence, to protect civilians. That strategy, when it's indigenous, can be supported externally, but it can't be carried out by international troops, in my opinion. You know, so Colombia and the FARC, all right, complicated, but not the same as Afghanistan. But we never put 100,000 troops down in Colombia, even though we were constantly supporting, and sometimes some pretty nasty Colombian governments. We never presumed that our capacity was better than their capacity. We were just trying to crank up their capacity. And, you know, so ultimately Colombians themselves have gotten to where they've gotten, highly polarized, but, you know, it worked the way COIN says it's supposed to work, but it worked on Colombian terms among Colombians, with the Americans involved indirectly, and other countries like Cuba and others involved indirectly.
Maybe I'll use my privilege to ask a question. I wanted to come back to Holbrooke and the fear of history. Obama comes in 2009, and he's pressured to go with the flow. Forces are ramped up, and he doesn't want to hear about Vietnam because he feels certain that this is something we have to press forward. In the second term, there's a red line in Syria, and there's no move to enforce the red line after it's crossed. And, you know, Obama talks about not wanting to do stupid stuff, not wanting to be in another Vietnam. Did something happen to Obama along the way, or is this a question of national interests, there being different in the two cases, or is this a country that either can't identify its national interests or doesn't have policymakers that know how to promote those interests?
Yeah, it's a great question, complicated. I mean, I would say the simplest answer, did something happen, is, yeah, Libya. Because the president had divided advice on whether to intervene in Libya. The reason to intervene was because Gaddafi's forces were moving towards Benghazi unopposed, And it looked like, based on what Gaddafi was saying, that they were going to go in there and slaughter the residents of Benghazi. And you had Samantha Power, the author of Problem from Hell, who was a human rights, ran a human rights center at Harvard, and who was an advocate for a measured version of the responsibility to protect, which was the doctrine that emerged in the late 1990s, holding that where dictatorships imperiled the lives and security of very large numbers of people, the international community had a responsibility to protect those civilians. And the lessons of Kosovo and of East Timor and of the British intervention in Sierra Leone, you know, Tony Blair's famous Chicago speech about a new doctrine of liberal intervention had accumulated in one wing of the Obama administration. It wasn't really relevant to Afghanistan as much, but it was certainly present in that debate. But it was directly relevant to Libya because the United States had no self-defense interest to intervene in Libya. The reason to intervene was to stop the people of Benghazi from being slaughtered. And there was a very, heated debate about whether this should be done. Obama ended up, leading from behind in that unfortunate phrase, but he did endorse intervention and put the Americans in with the Brits and the French in bombing and stopping Gaddafi, ultimately led to the Libyan revolution, Gaddafi's murder. And look at Libya today. By the time Syria fell apart, the failure of the intervention in Libya and the unintended consequences of uncorking that particular dictatorship for international security, for regional security, were becoming apparent to Obama. And I think that very much influenced his attitude about Syria because a very similar kind of drumbeat was building. It was really about the extraordinary suffering of Sunni civilians in Syria and Assad's ruthless willingness to keep attacking civilians and the ugly cynicism of the regime using chemical weapons that led to the Red Line. I think it'll be the subject of really good books and PhD dissertations to unpack exactly how that decision not to act went down. But it was, I think there's a little bit of it in the Ben Rhodes book that's out. But it was the president's decision. He did not want to respond in the way that he had responded in Libya for fear of the unintended consequences. And in defense of the Obama administration, they did get Syria with the Russian deal to dismantle quite a lot of their chemical weapons arsenal. The problem with that whole project is that chemical weapons are very easy to reconstitute if you have the scientific means and the talent. So that Syrians have reconstituted chemical weapons and been using them recently horribly. So, I think the best legacy take on President Obama's thinking about the world is the series of interviews he gave to Jeff Goldberg in The Atlantic in 2016. And Jeffrey is a great journalist, has been around a lot of these wars himself, and he asked all the hard questions, and Obama gave very, clear answers. It's a very helpful way to think about where he ended up. I think there's a critique even from colleagues of mine at the New Yorker, George Packer, reviewing Ben Rhodes' book, who would argue, yes, Mr. President, I respect where you're coming from, especially after Libya, but the consequences, the unintended consequences of doing nothing can also be significant. And that's the kind of story of Syria in some ways, too. Yes, please. One last.
Yeah. I just had one question about your profession in general. You've been doing this for a long time, and over the last 30 years or so, the media environment has gone through a lot of changes. And I just wanted some insights, I guess, if you had any, some thoughts about how the role of foreign correspondent has kind of changed and how it fits into this kind of changing information environment.
Yeah, I think it's changing for good. I think the era of the parachute, white male, institutionally supported international correspondent is yielding to a much more interesting landscape of American and indigenous international correspondence at a lot of different global publishers. One of the big advantages of the digital revolution from an international news gathering and publishing perspective is that everybody's a global publisher now. And And that makes it much easier to restructure your correspondence and to have Iraqis covering Iraq, or folks who are, to prioritize language and to create teams. And, I was saying at dinner, we have a visiting faculty member this year, a woman named Azmat Khan, who is just one of the exemplary international correspondents of her generation, or any. And she did this big project for the New York Times about civilian casualties in Mosul during the aerial campaign against the Islamic State. Now, I've never had lunch with Azmat, so I don't really know her story, but my impression is that she's of Pakistani origin, maybe grew up in the Gulf, speaks fluent Arabic, speaks Urdu, has American citizenship and working for an American news organization, so she can be protected in the ways that that's helpful. But she walked the streets of Mosul with a colleague, a guy of Indian origin who's also fluent in Arabic, and is based at NYU, I think, these days. They went block to block, and they did almost like a public health survey of civilian casualties. Now, that's the new international correspondence. I have a former researcher on the book before this one about ExxonMobil, woman named Megha Rajagopalan, who, she grew up in Maryland, and she speaks Tamil, but she taught herself Mandarin, and she went to China for BuzzFeed, of all places, and she became the BuzzFeed correspondent in China. And she came back, and she's just moving to do a global beat for BuzzFeed about the human rights and social media, basically, on a global basis. It was a great job, fantastic job. She came in the other day to talk to students, and very proud of her. She's just rocking it. But the conversation among them about the future of international correspondence was all about this. And Megha was saying, the era of the New York Times guy coming in his trench coat is gone. It's not happening. And there's a lot of discourse on social media about agency and national kind of writers, and there are some things that an American passport holder can helpfully do in a team, because they're not going to go to jail, and they can get on the plane and get out, and the indigenous correspondents can't. You may have seen the case of the 2 Reuters correspondents in Myanmar who were jailed for their reporting about the massacres of the Rohingya. Still are. It's a big campaign in journalism and human rights now. Now, Reuters is a super blended institution with headquarters in London and in the US. They do a lot of financial news, but the international correspondence is often drawn from these national settings, and those 2 guys paid the price for what was a really huge scoop, because they couldn't get on the plane and get out. So, managing, and hopefully they'll be released, and if anyone offers you a chance to write a postcard, do it. But, the fluency, the fluidness of the digital age is actually really, I think, great for international correspondence. It makes, from an American's perspective, it means you need to develop a different kind of career, but there's still, that work is still there. And it really, what it says is, if you want to compete as an international correspondent today, you've got to get a language, and then go work in that language. Yes?
Do you think today, in general, in 2018, that the politicians, the House, the Senate, adequately understand COIN and what it's supposed to look like after 17 years of being, involved in one operation?
No.
Could I suggest that we continue the conversation at Merrill House? We'll move to Merrill House for drinks and desserts. Please do join us tomorrow, 7